The courtroom went dead silent, the kind of silence that usually precedes a natural disaster. Julian Thorne didn't just walk into the Superior Court of New York. He strutted, wearing a $3,000 smile and holding the hand of his pregnant mistress, Bianca. He thought the game was over. He thought his billions, his high-priced lawyers, and his arrogance had already bought him the victory. He looked at his wife Alice and saw a broken woman. But he wasn't looking at the bench. He wasn't looking at Judge Harrison Sterling, a man who didn't care about bank accounts, only facts. And he certainly wasn't looking at the sealed manila envelope in the judge's left hand, a thin packet of paper that was about to turn Julian's smile into a scream. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung open with a theatrical flair that seemed entirely out of place for a divorce hearing. It was November 14th, a dreary Tuesday in Manhattan, but inside the climate-controlled walls of the legal system, the temperature was about to skyrocket. Julian Thorne, CEO of Thorne Logistics, and the newly minted darling of the tech shipping world, entered the room as if he were stepping onto a yacht. He was a man who took up space. Standing 6'2" with hair greased back in a style that screamed old money, despite his wealth being entirely new, Julian radiated an untouchable aura. He wore a bespoke navy suit cut sharply to emphasize his broad shoulders, the kind of suit that cost more than most people's cars. But it wasn't the suit that drew the collective gasp from the gallery. It was the woman on his arm. Bianca Vore. She was 24, exactly half the age of the woman sitting at the plaintiff's table. Bianca was draped in a crimson dress that hugged her noticeable baby bump, a calculated fashion choice designed to be a weapon. In family court, bringing a mistress was considered poor taste. Bringing a pregnant mistress to the final asset division hearing was an act of nuclear warfare. Julian guided Bianca to the front row of the gallery, right behind his defense table. He leaned down, whispered something into her ear that made her giggle a sharp, piercing sound that echoed off the high ceilings and kissed her on the cheek. He then turned, caught the eye of his wife, Alice, and smirked. It was a smile of pure, unfiltered cruelty. It said, "I have replaced you. I have won. You are nothing." Alice Thorne sat frozen. She was a woman of small stature, dressed in a simple charcoal grey blazer that had seen better days. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. To the onlookers, she looked defeated. She looked like the quintessential discarded first wife, the woman who had scrimped and saved while her husband built an empire only to be traded in for a newer model the moment the stock price hit triple digits. "Mr. Thorne," the bailiff warned, eyeing the display with distaste. "Take your seat." Julian winked at the bailiff, a man named Officer Miller, who had seen it all and slid into the leather chair next to his attorney, Marcus Kane. Marcus was a shark in a suit, known in New York, legal circles as the Butcher, for how he carved up spouses in divorce settlements. "Ready to wrap this up?" Julian whispered to Marcus, loud enough for Alice to hear. "I have a lunch reservation at Le Bernardin at 1. I don't want to be late." "It'll be quick, Julian," Marcus assured him, organizing a stack of files that looked like a skyscraper compared to Alice's single thin folder. "She has no leverage. The prenup is ironclad, and with the baby on the way, the court will favor your need to retain liquid assets for the growing family." "Good," Julian grunted, adjusting his silk tie. At the other table, Alice's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Jenkins, leaned in toward her client. Sarah was not flashy. She didn't have billboards in Times Square like Marcus did, but she had a reputation for being meticulous, a legal surgeon who cut where it mattered. "Don't look at them, Alice," Sarah whispered softly. "Let him peacock. Let him feel safe. Arrogance is the best anesthesia before the surgery." Alice nodded, taking a slow, shaky breath. He brought her Sarah. He actually brought her. "I know," Sarah replied, her eyes narrowing, as she glanced at Bianca, who was currently checking her makeup in a compact mirror, oblivious to the solemnity of the court. And that was his first mistake. "All rise," Officer Miller bellowed. The door behind the bench opened, and Judge Harrison Sterling emerged. The courtroom shuffled to its feet. Judge Sterling was a legend in the New York family court circuit. He was a man of 60, with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to possess X-ray vision. He had zero tolerance for theatrics, and even less for liars. He adjusted his robe, sat down, and peered over his reading glasses. He didn't look at the lawyers. He looked straight at Julian Thorne. Then his gaze drifted to the gallery landing squarely on Bianca in her red dress. His brow furrowed slightly, a micro-expression of disapproval that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Be seated." Judge Sterling commanded his voice, a deep baritone that demanded absolute attention. He opened the file in front of him. "We are here for the final judgment in the matter of Thorne versus Thorne, division of assets, alimony determination, and finalization of the dissolution of marriage." Sterling looked up. "I trust both parties have submitted their final financial disclosures." "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus Cohn said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "We have provided full documentation. Mr. Thorne has been more than generous in his settlement offer, considering Mrs. Thorne's lack of contribution to the company's success in the last decade." Alice flinched. Lack of contribution. "And the plaintiff?" Judge Sterling asked, looking at Sarah. "We have submitted our evidence, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steady, "including new exhibits regarding the defendants' unique financial accounting and lifestyle choices." Julian chuckled audibly. He leaned back, crossing his legs. He felt invincible. He had hidden the offshore accounts in the Caymans under shell companies named after his childhood pets. He had transferred the intellectual property rights to a trust in Bianca's name just 3 weeks ago. He was 5 steps ahead, or so he thought. "Mr. Thorne, Judge Sterling," said his voice, cutting through Julian's internal victory lap. "I see you have brought a guest today." Julian stood up, flashing that charming smile that had wooed investors for years. "Yes, Your Honor. This is Bianca Vore, my fiancée, and the mother of my future son." A ripple of whispers went through the courtroom. "Fiancée," Judge Sterling repeated the word, tasting like vinegar in his mouth. "While you are still legally married to the woman sitting 10 feet away from you. Technicalities, Your Honor." Julian waved his hand dismissively. "The marriage has been dead for years. Bianca represents the future. I thought it important she be here, as the ruling affects our child's welfare." "The welfare of the child," Sterling echoed. He picked up a pen and tapped it rhythmically against the bench. Tap, tap, tap. Interesting choice of words. Sterling looked down at a specific document on his desk. It wasn't the financial report. It was a sealed envelope with the logo of Helix Gen Labs stamped on the corner. "Very well," the judge said, his face unreadable. "Let us proceed. But be warned, Mr. Thorne, in my courtroom, the future is often determined by the secrets of the past, and today the past has quite a bit to say." Julian sat down, whispering to Marcus. "What is he talking about, old man, is senile. Just standard judicial posturing." Marcus dismissed it. "Focus on the money." But Alice wasn't looking at the money. She was watching the judge's hand, which was now resting protectively over that sealed envelope. For the first time that morning, a tiny ghost of a smile touched her lips. To understand why the air in courtroom 4B was so thick with tension, one had to understand how Julian and Alice Thorne had arrived at this precipice. 15 years ago, there was no Thorne logistics. There was only a cramped 1-bedroom apartment in Queens and a mountain of student debt. Julian was a charismatic, but scatterbrained visionary, with big ideas about supply chains and automated shipping. Alice was the grinder. She was a brilliant actuary, with a mind for patterns and risk assessment. While Julian pitched investors and charmed clients at dinners he couldn't afford, Alice sat at the kitchen table until 4 a.m., coding the logistical algorithms that would eventually become the backbone of the company. She wrote the business plan. She balanced the books. When they couldn't make payroll in 2014, she sold her grandmother's jewelry, the only inheritance she had to keep the lights on. They were partners in every sense of the word. But as the company grew, the dynamic shifted. Julian became the face of Thorn Logistics. Magazines called him a solo genius. He stopped correcting them. He started attending galas alone, claiming Alice wouldn't enjoy the networking. He bought the suits, he bought the penthouse, and slowly he bought into his own hype. Alice was pushed into the background. She became the supportive wife, the invisible engine keeping the Ferrari running. She tolerated his long nights, his sudden business trips to Milan and Tokyo, and his growing irritability. She told herself it was the stress of success. Then came Bianca. Bianca Vore was hired as a brand consultant for the company 2 years ago. She was sharp, ambitious, and hungry. She saw Julian not as a partner, but as a ladder. It started with late-night strategy sessions, then working dinners, and finally weekend getaways disguised as conferences. Alice wasn't stupid. She saw the credit card charges. She smelled the perfume, Chanel No. 5, decidedly not her scent on his shirts. But the crushing blow came 6 months ago. Alice had come to the office to surprise Julian for his birthday. She had walked past his executive assistant, opened the heavy mahogany doors and found them. They weren't working. They were planning a life without her. "I need to cut her loose before the IPO," Julian was saying, a glass of scotch in his hand. "If I divorce her after we go public, she gets half the stock. I need to do it now. We'll offer her a settlement, tell her the company is struggling." "And if she fights?" Bianca's voice had purred. "She won't. Alice is weak. She hates conflict. She'll take the check and cry in the Hamptons." Alice had closed the door silently, her heart shattering into dust. But in that dust, something hard and sharp had formed. She didn't confront them. She didn't scream. She went home, wiped her tears, and called Sarah Jenkins the toughest forensic accountant and divorce attorney in the state. For 6 months, Alice played the role of the oblivious wife. Meanwhile, Sarah and her team were digging. They found the shell companies. They tracked the hidden assets. And then they found something else. Something biological. Back in the courtroom, the memory of that discovery made Alice sit straighter. "Mr. Kane, you may begin your opening regarding the assets," Judge Sterling stated. Marcus Kane stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor. The defense posits that Thorn Logistics is solely the result of Mr. Thorn's vision. Mrs. Thorn has not been an employee on record for 10 years. She has enjoyed a lavish lifestyle provided by my client. We are offering a lump sum of $2 million and the beach house. In exchange, she waives all rights to future earnings and stock options." $2 million. Sarah Jenkins shot up. "The company is valued at $4 billion. That is 0.05% of the marital estate." "A valuation based on future projections," Marcus countered smoothly. "Liquid assets are low. Mr. Thorn has significant overhead. And as noted, he has a new dependent on the way. A child who will require security." Julian nodded solemnly, looking at the judge. "I have to think of my son, Your Honor. Bianca is 7 months pregnant. I need to ensure his future is secure." "Your son?" Judge Sterling repeated, his eyes drifting to Bianca in the gallery. She smoothed her dress over her belly, looking appropriately demure. "Yes, Your Honor." Julian said, his voice thick with fake emotion. My legacy. It is interesting you speak of legacy, Mr. Thorne, Sarah Jenkins said, stepping out from behind her table. Because that is exactly what we are here to discuss. Not just the legacy of money, but the legacy of biology. Julian frowned. Objection. Relevance. Overruled, Sterling said sharply. I want to hear where this is going. Sarah walked to the center of the room. Mr. Thorne claims he needs to hoard assets for his unborn child. He claims this child is the reason he cannot provide a fair settlement to the woman who built his company from a kitchen table. But, Your Honor, if the premise of his financial hardship is the child, shouldn't we be certain of the child's parentage? Julian laughed a harsh, barking sound. Is this a joke? Are you implying Bianca is cheating? She's devoted to me? Unlike some people, she knows loyalty. He shot a glare at Alice. I am not implying anything, Sarah said calmly. I am dealing in facts, and the fact is, during the discovery phase, we found medical records that you, Mr. Thorne, seem to have forgotten about. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. What records? From 2018, Sarah continued. When you and Alice were trying to conceive, you visited the fertility specialist, Dr. Eris Thorne, no relation, just a coincidence. You underwent a series of tests. Julian's face went pale. He remembered the tests. He remembered being told everything was fine, or at least that's what he told Alice. He had been too busy to go to the follow-up appointment. He had just assumed the stress was the issue. I don't see how my medical history is relevant, Julian stammered, looking at Marcus for help. Marcus looked confused. Julian hadn't told him about this. It is relevant, Judge Sterling interjected, because the court ordered an independent verification based on the evidence submitted by the plaintiff last week. A verification that required a DNA sample from you, Mr. Thorne, which you provided during the paternity deposition for the other matter. Julian froze. He had given a swab 2 weeks ago, thinking it was just a formality for the custody agreement of the new baby. I have the results right here, Judge Sterling said, lifting the sealed envelope. The sound of the paper crinkling echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Bianca in the back row stopped smiling. She shifted in her seat, her eyes darting from Julian to the judge. Mr. Thorne. The judge said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You walked in here, holding that woman's hand, smiling as if you owned this court. You insulted your wife. You lied about your assets. But science does not lie. Sterling began to tear open the envelope. Judge Harrison Sterling didn't rush. He pulled the single sheet of paper from the envelope, smoothed it out on the mahogany bench, and adjusted his spectacles. The silence in the room was so absolute that the hum of the HVAC system sounded like a jet engine. Julian Thorne was still standing, his knuckles gripping the edge of the defense table. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a sensation he hadn't felt since the early days of risking bankruptcy. He looked at Bianca. She was staring straight ahead, her face a mask of porcelain perfection. But Julian noticed a tiny bead of sweat tracing a path down her temple. Mr. Thorne. Judge Sterling began, his voice devoid of emotion. This document is a certified medical analysis from Helix Gen Labs dated October 24th of this year. It compares your DNA profile against the genetic markers required for paternity. And, Julian demanded, his voice cracking slightly, tell them it's my son. Tell them I need to protect my assets for my heir. The report, Sterling continued, ignoring the outburst, cross-references your sample with a medical diagnosis from 2018, which was subpoenaed by the plaintiff. That diagnosis made by Dr. Eris Thorne states that you suffer from a condition known as congenital bilateral absence of the vas deferens. The judge looked over his glasses, locking eyes with the billionaire. For those in the court not versed in medical terminology, Sterling said, his voice rising so the back row could hear, it means you were born without the tubes that carry sperm. Mr. Thorne, according to medical science, it is biologically impossible for you to father a child naturally. You have been sterile since birth. The words hung in the air like smoke. Julian blinked. Once. Twice. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. That's a lie. That's a mistake. We've been trying. Bianca is pregnant. Look at her. He pointed a shaking finger at his mistress. The test results are conclusive, Judge Sterling said, dropping the paper. 0.0% probability of paternity. Mr. Thorne, you are not the father of the child Ms. Vore is carrying. In fact, you cannot be the father of any child. Julian turned slowly toward the gallery. The arrogance that had armored him for the last hour stripped away, leaving a confused, terrified man. He looked at Bianca Vore. Bianca, he whispered. Bianca didn't look at him. She was gripping her purse, her knuckles white. She looked at the exit sign, calculating the distance. Tell him, Bianca! Julian pleaded, his voice rising to a shout. Tell him the doctors are idiots! Tell him it's mine! Bianca finally turned her head. Her eyes, usually warm and seductive, were cold and hard. The mask dropped. There was no love there. There wasn't even pity. There was only annoyance, the look of a gambler who realizes the horse she bet on just broke a leg. Oh, shut up, Julian, Bianca snapped. The gallery gasped. The sound was like a thunderclap. What? Julian recoiled as if slapped. I said, shut up, she hissed, standing up. You arrogant fool. Did you really think you were that virile? You're 45, and you drink like a fish. Of course it's not yours. Then, whose is it? Julian stammered, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. Bianca laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. Does it matter? It was a ticket to the penthouse, to the trust fund, to the life you promised me. But clearly your ex-wife is smarter than you are. She glared at Alice, who hadn't moved a muscle. Alice simply watched her expression, calm like a scientist, observing a chemical reaction she had predicted perfectly. You played me, Julian whispered, the reality crashing down on him. I bought you a condo. I transferred the Jagged Edge stocks to your name. I was going to leave everything to that boy. Well, you can ask the pool boy for the stocks back, Bianca sneered. I'm leaving. Officer Miller, Judge Sterling's voice boomed. Restrain the witness. No one leaves this courtroom until I say so. This hearing has just evolved from a civil asset division into a criminal inquiry regarding fraud. Officer Miller stepped in front of the swinging gate, blocking Bianca's path. She slumped back into the bench, crossing her arms, furious. Julian collapsed into his chair. He felt like he couldn't breathe. He looked at Marcus Kane, his shark lawyer. Marcus was frantically flipping through papers, his face pale. You knew, Julian said, turning to his lawyer. Did you know? No, Julian, I swear, Marcus stammered. I just handled the prenup. I didn't know about the medical history. But she did, Julian realized. He slowly turned his head to look at the plaintiff's table. Alice was looking right at him. For the first time in years, he truly saw her. She wasn't the mousy woman he had discarded. She was the woman who had built his algorithms. She was the one who solved problems. And Julian Thorne was the problem she had just solved. Order! Judge Sterling banged his gavel, silencing the murmurs that had erupted in the gallery. Mr. Kane, control your client, or I will hold him in contempt. We are not done. Julian sat there hollowed out. The revelation of his sterility did more than just destroy his relationship with Bianca. It shattered his self-image. He wasn't the virile king of industry. He was a cuckold, a fool, and everyone in the room knew it. Your Honor, Sarah Jenkins spoke up, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. Now that we have established that there is no heir, and thus no need for the future family security fund that Mr. Thorne argued was necessary, we would like to address the matter of the marital assets. Proceed, Sterling said, leaning forward. Mr. Thorne's entire defense for offering my client a pittance was based on financial hardship due to his expanding family, Sarah said, walking toward the bench. Since that family is a fiction, we return to the prenup. Mr. Kane described it as ironclad. We agree. It is ironclad. Sarah pulled a thick document from her file. Clause 14. Section B, Sarah read aloud. The infidelity and good faith clause. It states that if either party engages in extramarital affairs that result in public scandal or financial misappropriation of company funds for a third party, the offending party forfeits their right to the primary shareholder status in Thorne Logistics. Marcus Kane shot up. Objection. That clause was boilerplate. It was never meant to. It was signed, Mr. Kane, Judge Sterling interrupted, and I believe bringing a mistress to court who then admits to paternity fraud in front of a judge qualifies as a public scandal. Furthermore, Sarah continued, relentless, we have evidence that Mr. Thorne transferred $3 million of company assets to a shell corporation controlled by Miss Vore in anticipation of this child. That is financial misappropriation. Julian looked up, his eyes bloodshot. I can fix it. I'll get the money back. Alice, please. We can settle this. Half. I'll give you half. Alice finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but in the acoustic perfection of the courtroom, it carried like a bell. I don't want half, Julian. Julian looked at her confused. What do you want? The house, the cars, take them. I don't want the things you bought, Alice said, standing up. She didn't look angry. She looked disappointed. I want what I built. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, 10 years ago, when Thorne Logistics was founded, the core routing algorithm, the Thorne protocol that makes the company worth billions, was written on my laptop. It was my code. That's a lie, Julian shouted, desperation clawing at his throat. I designed the logic, she just typed it in. Mr. Kane, Sarah Jenkins said, holding up a USB drive. This is the original source code, time-stamped, and digitally signed by Alice Thorne 3 years before the company was incorporated. We also have emails from Mr. Thorne admitting he didn't understand how the recursive shipping loop worked and asking Alice to fix it before the investors see. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. He remembered those emails. He had been so lazy, so reliant on her genius. He never thought she would keep them. The prenup, Sarah continued, defines marital property as assets acquired during the marriage. But it defines intellectual property as belonging to the creator unless explicitly assigned. Alice never assigned the rights to the Thorne protocol to the company. She merely granted a revocable license. Sarah placed the USB drive on the judge's bench. As of this morning, Sarah said, turning to look at Julian with a smile that matched the one he had worn walking in, Alice has revoked that license. The room went dead silent again. Revoked, Julian whispered. You can't. The ships, the automated warehouses, the tracking systems, they all run on that protocol. If you revoke the license, the system shuts down, Alice finished for him. Within 24 hours, Thorne Logistics will be unable to route a single package. The stock will go to zero. Julian looked at Marcus. Marcus was shaking his head. She's right, Julian. If she owns the IP, she holds the kill switch. You don't have a company. You have a shell. Julian Thorne, the billionaire, the titan, the man who had walked in with a smile, realized he was standing on a trap door that had just opened. He wasn't losing half his money. He was losing his entire existence. "You can't do this," Julian pleaded, tears actually forming in his eyes now. "Alice, think of the employees. Think of the legacy." "I am thinking of the legacy," Alice said coldly. "My legacy. The one you stole. The one you tried to give to a mistress and a child that isn't yours?" Judge Sterling watched the exchange with a grim satisfaction. He picked up his gavel. "It seems the court has a very complex decision to make," Sterling said. "Mr. Thorne, you have committed perjury regarding your assets. You have misappropriated funds. And now it appears your company is built on stolen property." "Wait!" Julian screamed, standing up and rushing toward the plaintiff's table. "Alice, don't do this. We can work it out. I'll leave her. I'll fire Bianca. Just don't kill the company." Officer Miller stepped forward, his hand on his taser, blocking Julian. "Sit down, Mr. Thorne," the judge roared, "or you will await my ruling from a cell." Julian stumbled back, falling into his chair. He looked at Bianca, who was looking at her phone, ignoring him completely. He looked at Alice, who was calmly packing her bag. "We are taking a 1-hour recess," Judge Sterling announced. "Mr. Thorne, I suggest you use that time to speak with your attorney about a very different kind of settlement. Because if I have to make a ruling based on the fraud I've seen today, you will leave this courtroom with nothing but the suit on your back, and frankly, I'm not sure you'll even keep that." The conference room adjacent to courtroom 4B smelled of stale coffee and impending doom. It was a small windowless box with a fluorescent light that buzzed incessantly, a sound that seemed to drill directly into Julian Thorne's skull. Julian paced the length of the room, his expensive Italian loafers squeaking on the linoleum. His jacket was off, thrown carelessly onto a chair. His tie was loosened. The confident billionaire who had strutted into court an hour ago was gone. In his place was a cornered animal. Marcus Kane sat at the table, his head in his hands. He was furiously texting his firm's senior partners, trying to figure out how to salvage his own reputation from this train wreck. "Stop pacing, Julian," Marcus snapped, not looking up. "You're making me dizzy." "Stop pacing." Julian spun around, his eyes wild. "She's going to kill the company, Marcus. She's going to turn off the lights." "Do you understand what that means? The stock drops to pennies. The board sues me. The SEC investigates. I go from the cover of Forbes to a prison cell in 6 months. "I told you," Marcus said, his voice rising. "I didn't know about the code. You told me you built the system. You said she was just a glorified secretary. I thought she was—" Julian roared. "She never asked for credit. She never put her name on anything. How was I supposed to know she kept the source code on a private drive?" The door opened. The room went silent. Alice walked in, followed closely by Sarah Jenkins. Alice looked calm, almost ethereal. She held a bottle of water in her hand, taking a slow sip as she surveyed the room. She didn't sit down. She didn't need to. She held all the cards. "You have 5 minutes," Sarah said, checking her watch. "Then we go back in and ask the judge to enforce the revocation of the IP license." Julian rushed toward Alice, stopping just short of grabbing her arm, when he saw the look in her eyes, a look of absolute indifference. "Alice!" Julian started, his voice trembling. "Baby, please. We can't let this happen. We built this. "There is no we, Julian," Alice said softly. "There hasn't been a we since you missed my mother's funeral to go to a conference in Vegas. Do you remember that you sent flowers, orchids? My mother was allergic to orchids. You didn't even know." Julian flinched. I was busy. I was building our future." "No," Alice corrected him. "You were building your ego, and now you're going to pay for it." "I'll give you 70%. Julian offered, the desperation leaking from every pore. 70% of the assets. I'll keep the company, I'll keep the title, but you get the profits. Just let me keep the protocol running. Sarah laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. Mr. Thorne, you don't seem to understand the leverage here. We don't want the profits. We don't want the money. Then what? Julian screamed. What do you want? Alice stepped forward. She looked at the man she had once loved, the man she had sacrificed her 20s for the man who had paraded a pregnant mistress in front of her to humiliate her. I want you to resign, Alice said. Julian froze. What? I want your resignation, Alice repeated, her voice steady. Effective immediately. You step down as CEO. You surrender your voting rights on the board. You transfer your controlling interest to me. You want the company, Julian whispered. You don't even like the business side. You hate the meetings, the press. I do hate them, Alice admitted. But I love the company. I love what it could be. And I'm not going to let you drive it into the ground with your recklessness. You used company funds to buy a mistress a condo. You lied to shareholders about the IP ownership. You are a liability, Julian. I can't resign, Julian stammered. I am Thorne Logistics. It's my name on the building. We can change the name, Sarah suggested helpfully. I've always liked Alice Transport. If you don't sign, Alice said, her voice dropping an octave. I walk back into that courtroom. Judge Sterling grants the order. I revoke the license. The software stops. The trucks stop. The planes stay grounded. And by tomorrow morning you will be the CEO of a bankrupt crater. She slid a document across the table. It was a single page, a resignation letter already drafted. Sign it, Julian, Alice said. Or lose everything. Those are your only choices. Julian looked at the paper. He looked at Marcus, who gave a slight, defeated nod. There was no way out. The prenup he had relied on was his death warrant. The mistress he had flaunted was a fraud. The wife he had underestimated was the executioner. With a shaking hand, Julian Thorne picked up a pen. He felt like he was signing his own death certificate. He scrawled his signature, the ink bleeding slightly on the page. Done! He rasped, sliding it back. Are you happy now? Alice picked up the paper, checking the signature. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. No, Julian, she said, turning to the door. I'm not happy. I'm just finished. The courtroom seemed even colder when they returned. The gallery was buzzing with whispers. Word had spread that something massive was happening in courtroom 4B. Reporters were starting to filter into the back rows. Julian walked in like a ghost. He slumped into his chair, staring at the table. He was no longer the CEO of Thorne Logistics. He was just a rich man with a broken ego and a public humiliation to endure. But the humiliation wasn't over. Judge Sterling returned to the bench. I understand the parties have reached a settlement regarding the corporate assets. We have your honor. Sarah Jenkins said, submitting the resignation letter and the transfer of stock agreement. Mr. Thorne has agreed to step down from all executive positions and transfer controlling interest to Mrs. Thorne. In exchange, Mrs. Thorne grants a perpetual royalty-free license of the Thorne Protocol to the company, ensuring its continued operation. A gasp went through the room. The reporters in the back started typing furiously on their phones. Billionaire CEO ousted in divorce court. Very well, Judge Sterling said, looking at Julian with a mixture of pity and contempt. But we still have the matter of the paternity fraud and the financial misappropriation regarding Ms. Vore. Sterling turned his gaze to the gallery. Bianca Vore was still there, sitting in the back corner, guarded by Officer Miller. She looked bored, checking her nails. Miss Vore, Judge Sterling said, please approach the bench. Bianca stood up. She didn't look scared. She walked to the front with a sway in her hips that seemed entirely inappropriate for the gravity of the situation. "You have admitted that Mr. Thorne is not the father," Sterling said. "Yet you accepted nearly $3 million in gifts and transfers under the pretense that he was. That is fraud, Ms. Vore. Grand larceny, in fact." "It was a gift," Bianca shrugged. "He gave it freely. I never signed a contract saying the money was for the baby." "The court disagrees," Sterling said dryly. "But for the sake of the record, and to determine the extent of the conspiracy, the court orders you to disclose the true paternity of the child. Was there a co-conspirator? Was someone else helping you target Mr. Thorne's assets?" Julian lifted his head. He looked at Bianca. "Who is it?" he croaked. "Just tell me. Was it the trainer, the pool boy, who—" Bianca looked down at Julian. A slow, cruel smile spread across her face. "You really want to know, Julian?" she asked. "You think it was some random guy. You think I'm just some loose woman." She laughed. "I didn't target you, Julian. I was assigned to you." "Assigned?" Julian frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I didn't come up with the idea to seduce you," Bianca said, her voice dripping with venom. "I didn't know about the shell companies or how to hide the money. I needed help. I needed someone on the inside, someone who knew your accounts better than you did, someone who hated you just as much as I did." The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A man walked in. He was tall, wearing a charcoal suit that was sharper than Julian's. He had a calm, predatory confidence. He walked down the center aisle, ignoring the gasps of the crowd. Julian turned around. His eyes widened until they looked like they would burst. "Gavin," Julian whispered. It was Gavin Reed, the chief operating officer of Thorne Logistics, Julian's best friend since college, the man Julian had trusted to run the day-to-day operations while he was busy living the life, the man who had been the best man at Julian and Alice's wedding. Gavin walked right past Julian without even looking at him. He went straight to Bianca, placing a protective hand on her lower back. "It's okay, honey," Gavin said smoothly. "I've got it from here." "Gavin!" Julian stood up, knocking his chair over. What is this?" Gavin finally looked at him. His expression was one of pure, unadulterated loathing. "Sit down, Julian," Gavin said, his voice calm and professional, the same voice he used in board meetings. "You're the father," Julian screamed. "You my best friend." "Best friend?" Gavin scoffed. "Is that what you call it? I did all the work, Julian, for 10 years. I ran the logistics. I managed the personnel. I cleaned up your messes. And what did I get? You took the credit. You took the magazine covers. You took the bonuses. And you treated me like a glorified assistant. So you set me up." "We set you up," Gavin corrected, gesturing to Bianca. "Bianca and I have been together for 3 years. We knew you were weak. We knew your ego was your Achilles heel. So we gave you exactly what you wanted. A pretty girl to stroke your ego." "The pregnancy," Julian murmured. "Is mine," Gavin confirmed. "And the 3 million you transferred to her trust. That's in an account in the Cayman Islands that I control. It was my severance package, Julian, since I knew you'd never pay me what I was worth." Julian looked from Gavin to Bianca. The betrayal was total. His wife had taken his company legally. His best friend and his mistress had taken his dignity and his liquid cash. He had been played from every conceivable angle. "You're a thief," Julian spat. "I'll have you arrested." "For what?" Gavin smiled. "Accepting gifts. You signed the transfer orders, Julian. I have the documents. You were so busy showing off to Bianca, you didn't even read what you were signing. You authorized a consulting bonus for her shell company. It's all legal." Gavin looked at Judge Sterling. "Your Honor, as the biological father of the child, I am prepared to take full financial responsibility for Ms. Vore. We have no further need for Mr. Thorne's generosity." Judge Sterling looked at Gavin with a mixture of disgust and begrudging respect for the audacity of the scheme. "Mr. Reed," the judge said, "you may be clever, but you are standing in a court of equity. And while you may have outsmarted Mr. Thorne, you seem to have forgotten one thing." "And what is that?" Gavin asked smugly. "You assumed, Mr. Thorne would still be the owner of the company when the dust settled," Sterling said, gesturing to the plaintiff's table. Gavin frowned. He looked at Alice. "What do you mean?" Gavin asked, his confidence faltering for the first time. Alice stood up. She looked at Gavin, the man who had eaten at her table, the man who had pretended to be her friend while plotting with a mistress. "Hello, Gavin," Alice said pleasantly. "I suppose you haven't checked your email in the last 10 minutes. "What did you do?" Gavin demanded. "Julian resigned," Alice said, her voice sharp as a whip. "I am the majority shareholder and CEO of Thorne Logistics now." Gavin's face went pale. "So I'm the COO. You need me. I run the operations." "Actually," Alice said, picking up a piece of paper from her file, "that was the first thing I did as CEO. I fired you." You can't," Gavin stuttered. "I just did," Alice smiled. "For cause. Corporate espionage and conspiracy to defraud a shareholder, which means your stock options cancelled, your severance voided. And that company car you drove here, I'm having it towed right now." Gavin looked at Bianca. Bianca looked at Gavin. The severance package they had stolen was $3 million. But without his job, without his stock options, and with the lawsuits Alice was sure to file, Gavin was ruined. "And regarding that $3 million, Sarah Jenkins piped up, "since it was obtained through fraud, we will be filing an immediate freezing order on that Cayman account. You won't be able to buy a diaper, let alone a getaway ticket." The trap had snapped shut, not just on Julian, but on the vultures who had been picking at his bones. The chaos in courtroom 4B had reached a fever pitch. Gavin Reed, usually the picture of corporate composure, was now red-faced, screaming at his lawyer on the phone. Bianca Vore, realizing the gravity of the asset freeze, had physically recoiled from Gavin. "You said it was secure," Bianca shrieked, her voice cracking. "You said the Cayman account was untouchable. It was—" Gavin yelled back. "Until she took over the company, she has the corporate authorization codes. Now she can flag the initial transfer as theft." "So you have nothing?" Bianca asked, her eyes narrowing. "No job, no stock, no $3 million. I have my savings," Gavin stammered. "We can fight this. Who?" Bianca laughed, a cold, harsh sound that echoed off the walls. "There is no we, Gavin. I'm not raising a child in a rental apartment with a disgraced executive. Call me when you win the lottery." She turned on her heel and marched toward the exit, leaving Gavin standing there, mouth agape, holding the bag of a conspiracy that had just exploded in his face. Judge Sterling banged his gavel one final time. The sound was like the final nail in a coffin. "This court is adjourned," Sterling declared, his eyes lingering on Julian. "Mr. Thorne, the paperwork for the divorce is final. You are a single man. You have no alimony obligations as your ex-wife has waived them. However, I am referring the testimony of Miss Vore and Mr. Reed to the district attorney's office for investigation into fraud and embezzlement. I suggest you stay close to your attorney." Julian Thorne sat alone at the defense table. The room slowly emptied. The reporters rushed out to file their stories. The gallery cleared. Gavin had been escorted out by Officer Miller to discuss the towed vehicle. Finally, only Julian and Alice remained. Alice packed her briefcase with slow, deliberate movements. She snapped the lock shut, click, click, and stood up. She looked immaculate, strong, and entirely out of his league. Julian stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He walked over to the railing. He wanted to scream, to beg, to rage, but all he had left was a hollow emptiness. "Alice," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. She stopped. She didn't turn her body toward him, just her head. Her eyes were clear, free of the tears that had stained her face for the last year. "What will you do?" Julian asked. It was a stupid question, but he didn't know what else to say. "I'm going to the office," Alice said simply. "I have a lot of work to do. The code needs to be updated. The rebranding starts tomorrow. Thorn Logistics is dead. We're calling it Phoenix Systems." "Phoenix," Julian repeated, "rising from the ashes." "Exactly," she said. "And me." Julian asked, a pathetic note of hope in his voice. "What happens to me? I built that company, Alice. I was the face. People love me." Alice finally turned to face him fully. She looked at him with a pity that was far worse than hatred. "People loved the image we created for you, Julian," she said softly. "They loved the success. But the money is gone. The title is gone. The wife is gone. And your best friend and mistress just showed you exactly how much they loved you." She reached into her purse and pulled out a single crisp $10 bill. She placed it on the railing in front of him. "What is this?" Julian stared at the money. "Cab fare," Alice said. "It's a long walk back to Queens. That's where you started, isn't it? Maybe you can find yourself again there. Because the man standing here, I don't know him at all." Alice turned and walked out of the double doors. Her heels clicked rhythmically on the marble floor, a sound of progress, of moving forward. Julian watched her go. He looked down at the $10 bill. He looked around the empty courtroom that had been the stage for his destruction. He had walked in a billionaire, a husband, a father-to-be, and a king. He picked up the bill. He walked out into the cold November rain, a man with nothing but a cheap suit and the bitter taste of a justice he never saw coming. 1 year later, the giant digital billboard in Times Square flashed a new image. It was the cover of Fortune magazine. The headline read, "The Silent Architect Speaks Alice Thorn and the Rise of Phoenix Systems." On the street below, a man in a faded windbreaker paused to look up. He had a graying beard and tired eyes. He was holding a stack of flyers for a discount electronics store. Julian stared at the screen. Alice looked radiant, powerful, happy. "Hey buddy, keep moving," a pedestrian grumbled, bumping into him. "You're blocking the sidewalk." "Sorry," Julian muttered. I used to know her." "Yeah, sure you did, pal." The stranger laughed, walking away. "And I used to be the King of England." Julian watched the screen for one more second, then turned his collar up against the wind. He disappeared into the crowd, just another anonymous face in the city he once thought he owned. And that is the story of Julian Thorn, the billionaire who thought he could buy everything, only to realize that the most valuable things, loyalty, love, and truth, aren't for sale. He walked in with a smile, but he walked out with a lesson that cost him everything. It's a brutal reminder that when you build a life on lies, the truth will eventually knock it down. Alice didn't just get revenge, she got justice. She took back her power not by screaming, but by being smarter, stronger, and patient. Now I have a question for you. If you were Alice, would you have left Julian with absolutely nothing, or would you have given him a second chance? Was the punishment too harsh, or did he get exactly what he deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I read every single one, and I'm dying to see whose side you're on. If you enjoyed this story of karma and justice, please smash that. Like button it really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss out on the next dramatic story. We have a crazy one coming up next week about a lottery winner who hid the ticket from his wife. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching. Stay safe and remember, the truth always wins. See you in the next one. A man's entire career can be made or broken in a single moment. For Marcus Thorne, a lawyer so sharp he could cut glass, that moment was coming. He was on the verge of winning the biggest case of his life, a case that would make him partner. The only thing standing in his way was the gavel of one man, the unshakable, notoriously ethical judge, Arthur Vance. But as Marcus stood in a crowded ballroom, he turned his razor-sharp cruelty on the one person he thought didn't matter, his quiet, unassuming wife, Elara. He grabbed her arm and hissed, not knowing that the judge he was trying to impress was the one man in the world he should never, ever have crossed. Marcus Thorne lived his life by a simple creed. Power was everything. And in the gleaming steel and glass towers of the city, power meant winning. At 34, he was the sharpest associate at the prestigious law firm of Sterling, Croft and Finch. He was the firm's chosen gladiator, and his arena was the courtroom. His current battle, the Kensington Holdings class action lawsuit. It was a beast of a case, one that had chewed up 2 senior associates before him. Kensington, a development Goliath, was accused of using substandard materials in a dozen high-rise condominiums, leading to structural failures and a litany of tenant complaints. Marcus's job wasn't to prove they were innocent. It was to make the problem disappear. It required a surgical blend of intimidation, procedural mastery, and leveraging every loophole in the civil code. And he was brilliant at it. He lived in a penthouse apartment that was as cold and perfect as his ambition. Everything was chrome white leather and glass. It was a home designed to be photographed, not lived in. And in this perfect, sterile box lived his wife, Elara Thorne. To Marcus, Elara was comfortable. She was the soft, muted background to his sharp, high-definition life. He'd met her 4 years ago at a fundraiser. She was quiet, sketched in a notebook, and seemed utterly unimpressed by his talk of billable hours and case law. He found that intriguing. She told him she worked in art, and her family was in government, which he'd translated to mean struggling artist and DMV-level bureaucracy. He saw her as a gentle, simple creature, a pretty low-maintenance accessory who managed his home, organized his dry cleaning, and asked for nothing. He was, in a word, dismissive. "Elara, what is this?" he'd snap, holding up a new painting she'd hung in the hall, a swirl of turbulent blues and golds. "I finished it last night. I thought it brought some warmth." "It looks messy. It looks amateurish, Elara. Clients come here. It makes us look soft. Take it down." He wouldn't even look at her face as he said it, already scrolling through emails on his phone. He treated her work at the local art co-op as a child's hobby. "It's sweet you have something to keep you busy while I'm closing the Kensington deal, honey," he'd say, patting her on the head. But the Kensington deal was hitting a snag. A big one. The case had been assigned to the one judge in the entire state Marcus couldn't read bully or charm, the Honorable Judge Arthur Vance. Vance was a legal legend, a man famously immune to political pressure and corporate influence. They called him the Iron Gavel. He was known for his piercing gaze and his obsession with a single abstract concept character. He'd been known to rule on procedural motions based on his perception of a lawyer's integrity. To Marcus, this was a terrifying variable he couldn't control. "The man is a ghost," Marcus vented to his rival and fellow associate, Julian Croft, in the firm's private lounge. He has no political donations, no golf club membership. How am I supposed to get a read on him? Julian, a man who favoured tailored suits and a more methodical, ethical approach to law, sipped his scotch. Maybe try the truth, Marcus. I hear he appreciates that. Marcus scoffed. The truth is a scalpel, Julian. You don't just hand it to the patient. You use it to cut out what you don't want. His strategy hinged on an upcoming event, the annual Bar Association Gala at the St. Regis Hotel. Judge Vance was the keynote speaker. It was Marcus's one chance to get in the same room, to make an impression, to show he was the kind of man Vance would respect. Elara, he called out, walking into their apartment that Tuesday. The scent of turpentine and linseed oil hit him, and he winced. She was in the spare room, her studio, her hands covered in paint. "Hi, Marcus. How was—" "You need a dress," he interrupted, loosening his tie. "The bar gala is on Friday. It's black tie, and not one of your handmade bohemian things. Go to Saks. Get something designer. Something simple, elegant, grey or navy. Don't try to make a statement. The last thing I need is you drawing the wrong kind of attention." Elara wiped her hands on a rag, her quiet expression unreadable. The bar gala. That sounds important. It's not sounds, Elara. It is— He snapped the stress of the case, making his voice sharp. "This is about the partnership. It's about our future. Everything is riding on this Kensington case, and Judge Vance will be there. I need to be perfect, which means you need to be perfect. Can you handle that? Just blend in. Smile, look pretty, and don't talk about art." She just nodded, turning back to her canvas. "Grey or navy?" "I understand, Marcus." He walked away, satisfied. He had the case, the plan, and the wife all under his control. The world was exactly as he'd built it. The St. Regis ballroom was a sea of power. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, casting a warm, golden light on the city's most formidable legal minds. Senators mingled with partners. Rivals clinked champagne glasses and shared false smiles. This was Marcus's element. He was electric, moving through the crowd with a predator's grace, his hand possessively on the small of Elara's back. She had followed his instructions perfectly. She wore a simple, elegant navy silk gown. Her hair was pulled back, and she wore only a simple pearl necklace. She was as he'd requested, an unobtrusive shadow. "Marcus, brilliant move on that motion to dismiss," said Arthur Sterling, the firm's senior partner, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. "You've got Kensington Holdings breathing easier." "We're not there yet, Arthur," Marcus replied, his voice a perfect blend of confidence and humility. "It all comes down to Vance. I'm hoping to get a moment with him tonight." "He's over by the dais," Sterling noted. "But he's difficult. Good luck. And Mrs. Thorne," he said, turning to Elara with a polite smile. "A pleasure. That's a lovely gown." "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," Elara said, her voice soft but clear. As Sterling moved on, Marcus leaned in his fingers, digging into Elara's arm. "See, that's how it's done. Just stay quiet. I need to go work the room. Don't wander off." He left her by a towering floral arrangement, and Elara watched him go. She saw the man she'd married, but she also saw a stranger, a man so desperate for approval he was willing to crush anything that didn't serve his immediate purpose. A quiet, deep-seated sadness settled on her. She'd spent 4 years believing the ambitious man was just one part of him, that the kind, curious man she'd met was still in there. Tonight she wasn't so sure. She felt a presence beside her. It was Julian Croft Marcus's internal rival. Elara. Julian said, his smile genuine. He wasn't looking at her as an accessory. He was looking at her. "I'm glad you came. I was hoping to see you." "Julian, it's good to see you too." "I finally went to the Midtown Arts Collective last week, like you suggested," he said, ignoring the legal chatter around them. "That new exhibit, the one with the reclaimed metal sculptures, it was astonishing. Your curation was brilliant. The way you used the light in that warehouse space, it was inspired." Ilara's face lit up a genuine, dazzling smile that Marcus hadn't seen in months. "You went, I'm so glad. Didn't you find the piece by Maria Sanchez just heartbreaking?" "The one with the welded chains." "Absolutely. It's amazing what you've done with that place, Ilara. You've turned it into a real cultural hub." From across the room, Marcus watched them. He saw his wife animated talking with his rival. A hot, ugly spike of jealousy and irritation shot through him. Julian was everything he wasn't, patient, cerebral, and Marcus suspected more respected by the firm's old guard. And now he was distracting Ilara, pulling her from her designated spot. He started to move toward them, his face a thundercloud, when the keynote speaker was announced. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our keynote speaker, Judge Arthur Vance." The room erupted in applause. Marcus aborted his path to Ilara and rushed to his table, which was to his delight near the front. He needed to be seen. Judge Vance took the podium. He was exactly as advertised, tall, silver-haired, with eyes that seemed to see everything. He commanded the room not with volume, but with an intense, quiet gravity. "We are guardians of the law," Vance began, his voice resonating through the microphone. "But the law is not just a collection of statutes. It is a living, breathing covenant of character, a man's true nature." He said, his eyes scanning the room, "is not revealed in the light under oath. It is revealed in the shadows. It is seen in how he treats those he believes have no power, how he acts when he thinks no one important is watching." Marcus was captivated, hanging on every word, nodding at the judge's profound wisdom. "This is my guy," Marcus thought. "He respects strength. He respects character. I just have to show him I have it." After the speech, as dessert was served, Marcus saw his chance. Judge Vance was momentarily alone, accepting a glass of water from a waiter. This was it. "Ilara now," he hissed, grabbing her hand and pulling her from her chair. "Come with me. I'll introduce you. Just smile and nod." He dragged her through the tables, his nerves making his grip painfully tight. As they approached the dais, a waiter carrying a heavy tray of coffee and desserts was bumped by another guest. The waiter stumbled, and the tray tilted. Ilara, walking slightly behind Marcus, saw it happening. She tried to step back, but Marcus was pulling her forward. The waiter corrected, but a single cup of hot black coffee flew from the tray, arcing directly onto the front of Marcus's pristine white tuxedo shirt. A collective gasp went up from the tables nearby. Time stopped. Marcus looked down at the dark, spreading stain. The heat was just beginning to seep through to his skin. All his planning, his perfect suit, his perfect moment ruined. And it was ruined in front of everyone. In front of Vance. He turned his face, a mask of incandescent rage. He didn't see the waiter. He didn't see the crowd. He only saw Ilara, who was standing there, mortified. "You!" He seethed. He didn't shout. He did something far worse. He grabbed her arm, the same one he'd been holding, and yanked her hard into a small, curtained alcove just off the main floor. The music and chatter of the gala muffled his voice, but not his fury. "Are you trying to ruin me?" He spat his voice, a low, venomous vibration. His face was inches from hers. "You clumsy, useless. You couldn't do one thing, one simple thing. Just stand there and not be a complete and utter embarrassment." "Marcus, it was an accident," Ilara whispered, trying to pull her arm free. His grip was like a vice. The waiter! I don't care about the waiter, he snarled. I care about me. I care about my partnership. You with your paint-stained fingers and your vacant-eyed staring. You just cost me everything. Why did I even bring you? You're nothing. You are a liability. Ilara's eyes filled with tears, a mix of pain and shock. Marcus, you're hurting me. Good, he hissed. Now you know how I feel. He shoved her arm away from him in disgust. Get out of my sight. Go to the bathroom. Fix your face. I'll deal with this mess you made. He turned to step back into the ballroom, adjusting his stained jacket, his mind already spinning on damage control. As he pushed aside the heavy velvet curtain, he almost collided with a man standing right outside the alcove, a man who had clearly heard every single word. It was Judge Arthur Vance. He wasn't looking at Marcus. He was looking past him into the alcove at Ilara, who was clutching her arm, tears streaming down her pale face. The judge's expression was unreadable, a cold, hard mask of granite. But then it softened into something Marcus had never seen. It was a look of pure paternal concern. Ilara. Judge Vance said, his powerful voice suddenly gentle. Are you all right? Marcus's blood turned to ice. His brain struggled to connect the dots. Ilara. Why was the judge? Ilara stepped out from behind the curtain, her tears stopping. Her face, which had been full of fear, now hardened with a cold, devastating resolve. She looked at her husband. She looked at the judge. And then she did the one thing Marcus Thorne could never have predicted. I'm fine, Dad, she said, her voice shaking but strong. I'm fine now. The world didn't just stop for Marcus. It inverted. The music from the ballroom, the clinking of glasses, the hum of 100 conversations, it all receded into a deafening, high-pitched whine. Dad. The word echoed in the cavern of his skull. Dad. 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 He looked at Judge Arthur Vance, the iron gavel, the man who held his entire future in his hands, the man whose keynote speech on character was still ringing in his ears. He looked at his wife, Ilara, his quiet, simple, art-obsessed wife, the liability, Ilara Thorne, Ilara Vance, Judge Arthur Vance. The pieces of the puzzle which he had been too arrogant to even see now slammed together with the force of a physical blow. Her family was in government. Her desire for privacy, her utter lack of interest in his world of power and influence, she hadn't needed it. She'd been born with it. Dad! Marcus stammered, his voice a pathetic croak. He felt the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin cold and clammy. Judge Vance's gaze shifted from his daughter to Marcus. The paternal softness vanished, replaced by a look of such profound glacial contempt that Marcus felt his knees weaken. The judge didn't say a word. He didn't need to. In that single silent moment, he'd judged Marcus Thorne, and the verdict was guilty. Ilara stepped forward past Marcus, as if he were a piece of furniture. She walked directly to her father. I'm sorry, Arthur, she said, calling him by his first name, as she often did in private. I didn't want to ruin your evening. You have ruined nothing, Ilara. Judge Vance said, his voice low and steady, yet carrying absolute authority. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, the one Marcus hadn't grabbed. His eyes flicked to the red marks forming on her other arm. Judge. Sir. Marcus sputtered, taking a step forward. He tried to manufacture a smile, a laugh, anything. This is a misunderstanding, a terrible family spat. You know how it is. The stress of the gala. Judge Vance held up a hand. It was a simple, short gesture, but it stopped Marcus mid-sentence, as effectively as a gag. Mr. Thorne, the judge said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. Do not speak. The gravity of the moment was pulling in onlookers. Julian Croft, who had been watching Elara with concern since Marcus dragged her away, was now approaching. Arthur Sterling, the senior partner, was right behind him, his face a mask of confusion. "Judge Vance, a pleasure to finally meet you," Sterling said, extending a hand, trying to inject normalcy into the tense tableau. "And I see you've met our rising star, Marcus Thorne, and his lovely wife, Elara." Judge Vance did not take Sterling's hand. He kept his eyes locked on Marcus. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice cutting through the air, "I have known Elara since the day she was born. She is my daughter." Arthur Sterling's professional smile froze and shattered. His eyes widened first at the judge, then at Elara, then at Marcus. He saw the coffee stain. He saw the red marks on Elara's arm. He saw the venom still clinging to Marcus's face and the cold fury on the judge's. And like Marcus, he understood everything. "Oh," Sterling said. It was a small, empty sound. Julian Croft stepped past the frozen partners and stood beside Elara. "Elara, are you okay? I saw him grab you." "I'm fine, Julian. Thank you," she said, giving him a small, grateful smile. The casual first-name basis between his rival, his wife, and the most powerful judge in the state was another knife in Marcus's gut. They knew. Julian knew. How many people knew? He realized the truth. He wasn't the center of the universe. He wasn't even a bit player. He was the court jester, the only one who didn't know the king and princess were related. Elara. Marcus tried again, his tone shifting to one of desperate, pleading intimacy. "Honey, please, let's go home. We can talk about this. I was stressed. The case. I didn't mean it." Elara turned to him. The tears were gone. Her eyes, which he had always mistaken for vacant, were as sharp and clear as her father's. They were the eyes of a judge. "No, Marcus," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with finality. "We've talked enough. You said everything you needed to say in that alcove. You told me I was nothing. You told me I was a liability." "I was angry. I was just talking." "No," she said, shaking her head. "That was the first time in 4 years you were completely honest. You finally told me what you really think of me." She turned her back to him, a gesture more definitive than any slap. "Dad," she said to the judge, "I'd like to go home." "Of course, my dear." Judge Vance put his arm around her shoulder. He then looked at Arthur Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, your firm is on my docket, Monday morning, the Kensington case, 9 a.m. Sterling, white as a sheet, just nodded. "Judge." "Mr. Croft," the judge said, nodding to Julian. "It was a pleasure to see you at the collective. Your donation was very generous." "My honor, Judge." "Elara," Julian said softly. "Take care." Judge Vance and Elara turned and walked away. They didn't storm off. They just left. They moved through the opulent ballroom, a father protecting his daughter, parting the crowd of legal royalty. And every single person saw them go. They saw the judge, they saw the quiet woman he was protecting, and they saw Marcus Thorne standing alone in the doorway, covered in coffee and shame. Marcus was left behind, standing between his apoplectic senior partner and his stunned rival. The music swelled. The party tried to resume, but a cancer had been cut open. Arthur Sterling turned to Marcus. His face was no longer confused. It was rigid with a fury that rivaled the judge's. "My office. Monday, 7 a.m. Sterling whispered, his voice shaking. "And God help you, Marcus, because I don't think anyone else can." The drive back to the penthouse was a 20-minute descent into hell. Marcus had fled the gala enduring 100 pairs of eyes that either stared with pity, curiosity, or open disgust. He'd barked at the valet peeled out of the St. Regis driveway and was now gripping the steering wheel of his black Mercedes so tightly his knuckles were white. Ilara, who had arrived with her father, had insisted on going back to the apartment alone to get her things. Her father had wanted to send his driver, but she'd been firm. "I'm not scared of him, Dad. Not anymore. I just need to get my bag." So she'd taken a cab, which had arrived just minutes before Marcus. He slammed the apartment door, the sound echoing in the cavernous, sterile living room. She was in the bedroom, pulling a suitcase from the walk-in closet. "Ilara!" He yelled, his voice a raw wound. The shock had worn off, replaced by a desperate, panicked rage. "You have to fix this." She didn't look at him. She calmly placed a few stacks of clothes into the bag. "Fix what, Marcus?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. "This, all of it. You have to go to him. You have to tell him I was stressed, that I'm a good man, that I love you. You have to tell him to recuse himself, or just to forget it. It was a fight. Couples fight." She zipped a side pocket and finally turned to look at him. "Tell him you love me," she repeated, as if the words were in a foreign language. "Did you love me 10 minutes ago, Marcus, in the alcove, when you told me I was nothing? I was angry," he roared, slamming his palm on the dresser. "The Kensington case, my partnership, my life, was on the line, and you humiliated me." "No," she said, her voice slicing through his tirade. "You humiliated me, and you humiliated yourself. You think that coffee stain is what ruined your night? You think that's what my father saw?" She walked past him, into her studio. The room he hated, the room that smelled of turpentine. She began carefully placing a few small framed sketches into a portfolio. "He saw you grab my arm," she continued, her back to him. "He heard you call me useless. He heard you say I was an embarrassment. He heard you, Marcus. He heard the real you, the one I've been living with for 2 years. That's not the real me," he pleaded, following her. He was desperate now, grabbing at straws. "The real me is the one who closes deals, the one who wins, the one who provides this penthouse." "This cage," she corrected him. She turned, holding a small, unframed painting of a bird, escaping a series of black geometric bars, the one he'd told her to take down. "You think I married you for this? I grew up in a house that could buy this building, Marcus. I never cared about the money. I never cared about the penthouse or the car or the designer clothes you made me buy." "Then what did you want?" he yelled, his frustration boiling over. "If you were Ilara Vance all this time, why marry me? Why hide it? You tricked me. You set me up." Ilara let out a short, bitter laugh. "Tricked you. Set you up, Marcus. I didn't hide who I was. I just didn't advertise it. When we met, I told you my father's name was Arthur Vance. I told you he was a judge. You were so busy talking about yourself you never even registered the name. You just assumed he was some small-time municipal judge. You assumed I was small-time." She stepped closer, her eyes boring into his. "I hid it, Marcus, because I was looking for one person. Just one. Someone who would see me. Ilara, the painter, the quiet woman who likes old books. I wanted someone who would love me, not my father's name. I thought for a little while that was you." "It is me," he insisted. "No," she said, her voice breaking for the first time, not with sadness, but with a lifetime of disappointment. "It's not. The man I met was curious and charming, but the man I married, he became this, controlling, dismissive, cruel. You didn't just dismiss my art, Marcus. You dismissed me every day. You told me my opinions were simplistic, You told me my work was a hobby. You systematically tried to sand away every part of me that wasn't your perfect, quiet wife. She picked up her suitcase from the bedroom and walked to the front door. The gala. That wasn't the first time you've yelled at me like that, was it? She asked softly. It was just the first time someone else heard. Someone you think is important. He had no answer. He could only remember the times he'd thrown a brief on the floor because she'd interrupted his train of thought, or the way he'd berated her for 20 minutes because she'd been 5 minutes late picking him up. "Where are you going?" he whispered, the panic rising again. "To his house, Ilara, wait. Don't leave me. Not tonight. Not before Monday. My career." She stopped at the door, her hand on the cold chrome handle. "That's all it's ever been about, isn't it? Your career. Your partnership. Your future." She looked at him one last time, with a devastating, clinical pity. "You know my father taught me that character is what you do when the stakes are high and no one is watching. But you, Marcus, you're the opposite. You're only good when someone important is looking. The rest of the time, you're just the man in the alcove. Ilara, please. Goodbye, Marcus." She opened the door. "Oh," she added as a final thought. "My father won't be recusing himself from the Kensington case. He's too ethical for that. He won't let his personal feelings interfere with his judgment." A tiny, insane sliver of hope flared in Marcus's chest. So I still have a chance." Ilara looked at him. "He won't have to. I suspect Mr. Sterling will handle it for him." She closed the door behind her. The click of the deadbolt locking was the loudest sound Marcus had ever heard. He was alone in the sterile silence, the smell of her paint and his failure hanging in the air. Monday morning at 6:45 a.m., Marcus Thorne walked into the lobby of Sterling Croft and Finch. The vast marble-floored expanse, usually a symbol of his power and ambition, felt like a funeral home. The night security guard, who usually gave him a cheerful, working hard Mr. Thorne, just looked down at his desk and pretended to be busy. The news had travelled at the speed of light. The texts and missed calls from other associates and even partners had been a relentless barrage all weekend. Some were curious, some were gleeful, but most were just silent. He was already a ghost. He took the silent elevator to the 50th floor. The doors opened onto a hushed, mahogany-panelled reception area. Arthur Sterling's executive assistant, a woman named Miss Davenport, who had been with him for 30 years, was already at her desk. "He's waiting," she said, her voice cold. She didn't offer him coffee. Marcus straightened his tie, a funereal black one, and pushed open the heavy oak doors to Sterling's corner office. The room was dark, the blinds still drawn against the rising sun. Arthur Sterling was sitting at his massive desk, not in his usual suit, but in a shirt and tie, looking as if he hadn't slept. Julian Croft was already there, standing by the window holding a folder. "Sit down, Marcus," Sterling said. It wasn't a request. Marcus sat in the leather chair opposite the desk. It felt like a long, long way from the man behind it. "I have spent the last 36 hours. Sterling began his voice, a low, controlled rumble, on the phone. First with our partners, second with the board of Kensington Holdings, and third with the ethics committee of the Bar Association. Marcus's blood ran cold. "The bar. Oh, yes," Sterling said, steepling his fingers. "It seems your behavior in the alcove was not just witnessed by Judge Vance. His personal clerk, Mr. Harrison, was standing not 10 feet away. He filed a report, not a legal one, but a memorandum of concern with the bar. He categorized your aggressive and demeaning conduct toward your wife as a potential violation of the character and fitness clause." That's insane. It was a private matter." Marcus protested, his voice rising. "Was it Marcus? Sterling slammed his hand on the desk, making Marcus jump. Was it private when you did it in a ballroom filled with every prominent lawyer and politician in this city? Was it private when you publicly humiliated the daughter of the presiding judge on your most important case? He can't rule against me because of this. He doesn't have to, Sterling roared. You've already lost. Kensington Holdings is pulling their account. They are uncomfortable being represented by counsel who has shown such catastrophic lack of judgment. Those were their exact words. They are retaining new counsel, effective immediately. Marcus felt the floor drop out. The case was gone. The case is the least of your problems, Sterling continued, his voice dropping back to that icy rumble. This firm's name is Sterling Croft and Finch, my name, Julian's grandfather's name. It is a name that has stood for integrity for 70 years. In one night you have associated that name with spousal abuse, arrogance, and profound stupidity. Arthur, I can fix this. I can apologize. I can make a statement. You will do no such thing. Sterling cut him off. You are suspended effective immediately pending a full partnership review, but I wouldn't hold your breath. As of this moment, you are to hand over all your case files, your building access card, and your company credit cards to Ms. Davenport. Julian Croft stepped forward and placed the folder on the desk. These are the transfer memos for your active files, Marcus. I'll be taking over Kensington until we transition it to the new firm. The ultimate humiliation. His rival, his polar opposite, was inheriting his kingdom. You, Marcus looked at Julian, his eyes wild. You knew, didn't you? You knew who she was. Julian looked at him, not with triumph, but with a weary disappointment. I knew Elara was Judge Vance's daughter, yes. We've served on the board of the Arts Collective for 2 years. I've been to her parents' house for dinner, and you never told me. Why would I? Julian asked, genuinely puzzled. It was her business. She's a private person. I respected that. Frankly, Marcus, I just assumed you knew. I thought your constant dismissal of her and her work was just a bizarre, cruel part of your marriage. I didn't realize you were also a complete fool. The words hit Marcus harder than any of Sterling's yelling. A fool. Get out, Marcus, Sterling said, turning to his computer. You're done here. Marcus stood up, his legs shaking. He was the golden boy. He was the shark. And in 10 minutes, he'd been reduced to nothing. He walked to the door, a dead man walking. And Marcus, Sterling said, not looking up. Marcus stopped his hand on the doorknob. I just got off the phone with Robert Finch, my partner, who happens to be on the board of your penthouse. Your lease application, which was up for co-op board review next month, has been denied. You have 30 days to vacate. Marcus didn't say a word. He just opened the door and walked out into the bright, busy, indifferent morning, a man with no job, no wife, and no home. 3 weeks later, Marcus was living in a corporate stay hotel in a part of town he used to fly over. The penthouse was a sterile box on the 10th floor with a view of a parking garage. The carpets were beige, the art was generic, and it smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. He'd spent the first week in a blind rage calling partners, leaving furious voicemails and trying to get Elara to answer his calls. He'd been met with a wall of silence. His calls went to voicemail. His texts went undelivered. She had blocked him. The second week was spent in a pit of self-pity, drinking expensive scotch he could no longer afford, and replaying the night at the St. Regis over and over in his mind. If only the waiter hadn't stumbled. If only Vance hadn't been standing there. If only Elara hadn't been so clumsy. Now in the third week, a cold, hard reality was setting in. He was a pariah. No firm would touch him. The Harrison memorandum had made the rounds. He was the guy who yelled at a judge's daughter. He was toxic. He'd been forced to hire a cut-rate lawyer just to negotiate his severance from Sterling, Croft and Finch. They were giving him 2 months' pay and a gag order, which he'd been forced to sign. Today he was back at the apartment. His apartment. The one he'd been so proud of. Ilara had arranged for movers to get her things, her clothes, her art, her books. She had, through her lawyer, given him 24 hours to remove any personal effects he wanted before the bank seized the contents to pay for the broken lease. He walked through the vast, empty rooms. The white leather sofas were gone. The glass tables were gone. The bed was gone. The only things left were his clothes, his collection of law trophies, and the one painting she'd hung in the hall. The messy one with the turbulent blues and golds. He stood in front of it. He saw it properly for the first time. It wasn't messy. It was powerful. It was a storm. And in the center, there was a single small point of calm, bright light. He reached out and touched the canvas, feeling the thick, dried paint under his fingertips. This was her. This was the woman he'd called simple. I didn't see, he whispered to the empty room. He walked into her studio. He'd only been in here a handful of times, always to complain about the smell. Now it was just a white, empty room. But on the floor in the corner was a single, forgotten sketchbook. His heart hammered. He knew he shouldn't. It was an invasion of privacy. But what did he have left to lose? He picked it up. He flipped through the pages. It wasn't just sketches of trees and landscapes. It was filled with him. There were sketches of him from their first year when they were dating. He was smiling, his head tilted, his eyes bright. She had captured a version of him he'd forgotten existed. Then the sketches changed. There was one of him on his phone, his back to her, his shoulders hunched and angry. Another of him at the dining table, his face hidden behind a stack of legal briefs drawn as a fortress. And then the last page. It must have been from a few weeks ago. It was a sketch of his face, but it was split in two. One half was the charming, smiling man she'd met. The other half was a monster, a contorted mask of rage, teeth, bared eyes empty. Underneath it she had written one word, "Which-or." Marcus sank to the floor, the sketchbook in his lap. It wasn't a setup. It wasn't a trap. It was a test. She hadn't been a passive victim. She had been an observer, a judge. She had been watching him, waiting for him, hoping for the man on the left side of the drawing to win. And at the gala in that alcove, the man on the right had won. He had given his final verdict on himself. He'd spent his entire life trying to impress people of power. He'd been living with the daughter of the most powerful man he'd ever meet, and he'd treated her like nothing. He hadn't just miscalculated. He had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power. He thought it was about shouting and winning and control. He'd been wrong. Real power was quiet. Real power was Ilara's paintbrush. It was her father's silence. It was the ability to see the world as it was, and to walk away from what was broken. He sat on the floor of the empty room, the drawing of the monster staring back at him. And for the first time in his adult life, Marcus Thorne wept. 6 months passed. The city in its relentless march had forgotten the small, sharp implosion of Marcus Thorne. Winter had come, scoured the streets with ice, and was now giving way to a muddy, tentative spring. The world had moved on, and the players in that grand ballroom tragedy had all found their new places in it. The legal world which Marcus had believed revolved around him had recalibrated in an afternoon. The Kensington Holdings class action, once his golden ticket, had been swiftly and quietly handed to Julian Croft. But Julian had not played by the Marcus Thorne rule-book. He hadn't intimidated. He hadn't drowned the opposition in procedural motions. Instead, he'd done something novel. He'd listened. Julian had arranged a meeting, not in a boardroom, but in the damp, cracked community centre of the very building in question. He'd brought Arthur Sterling and the entire Kensington board, and he'd brought Elara. Elara, in turn, had brought her artists. She had commissioned a photo documentary exhibit. For an hour, the executives were forced to look at 10-foot-tall, high-resolution photographs of the black mould spreading in a child's bedroom, the spiderweb of cracks in a foundation wall, the face of the elderly tenant, Mrs. Petrova, who had been without heat for 3 weeks. Julian hadn't argued case law. He'd simply pointed to the art and said, "This is your legacy. Fix it." Wary of Judge Vance's continued unblinking scrutiny, and perhaps for the first time, genuinely ashamed, Kensington Holdings caved. They settled for an amount that was triple what Marcus had been trying to whittle them down to. It included full structural remediation for all 12 buildings, and a public apology. Julian Croft, the quiet cerebral lawyer who believed in the truth, was made junior partner at Sterling, Croft and Finch. His star, lit by integrity, was burning brightly. Judge Arthur Vance continued to preside a pillar of granite in the shifting sands of the city's legal system. He was, as always, the iron gavel. But those in the know, those who had seen him at the gala, noted he was quicker to see through bluster, and his gaze was even more piercing when he detected an attorney bullying a witness or a junior associate. He had seen the monster up close, and he would not suffer its presence in his courtroom. Miles away, in the small, unremarkable town of Millfield, Marcus Thorne was learning to live with his own reflection. His life in the city had been vaporized. The penthouse, the Mercedes, the $800 suits, all gone liquidated to pay the catastrophic penalty for breaking his lease and the mountain of credit card debt he'd accrued to maintain an image. He was now living in a second-floor walk-up apartment above a bakery. The smell of yeast and sugar woke him at 5 a.m. every morning. His office was a small, dusty room on Main Street, shared with a real estate agent and an insurance broker. The gold-plated Marcus Thorne Escadist sign was gone, replaced by a simple vinyl sticker on the frosted glass. He was no longer a gladiator. He was a small-town mechanic. He handled DUIs, simple wills, and messy neighbor disputes. His clients weren't titans of industry. They were people like Mr. Henderson, a farmer fighting an easement, or Sarah Gable, a single mother whose son had been caught shoplifting. They came to him not for his shark-like aggression, but because he was the only lawyer in town who took payments in installments. He sat in his office, the fluorescent lights humming, listening to Sarah Gable cry. "He's a good boy, Mr. Thorne." She wept into a tissue. He fell in with the wrong kids. They said if he just... Oh, God. The old Marcus would have cut her off. He would have been calculating plea bargains, bullying the DA, and checking his watch. But the new Marcus just sat. He listened. He saw the panic in her eyes, a fear that was not about stock prices, but about a child's future. I can't pay you much," she whispered, ashamed. "Let's just focus on your son first, Sarah," he heard himself say. The words felt foreign in his mouth. They were not strategic. They were kind. After she left, he sat in the silence. He was for the first time doing work for people who needed help, not for corporations that needed protection. It was quiet, it was humbling, and it was an agonizing daily penance. That evening he walked back to his small apartment. It was sparsely furnished with second-hand items, save for one object. Hanging on the main wall, illuminated by a single lamp, was Elara's painting. The messy swirl of turbulent blues and golds. He had found it left behind in the penthouse, the only thing the movers hadn't taken. He'd packed it himself, his hands shaking. He stood before it now, as he did every night, a glass of cheap whiskey in his hand. He finally saw what she had been painting. It was a storm of rage, ambition, and chaos. But he also saw what he'd missed before. In the very center, almost invisible, was a single small, impossibly calm point of bright white light. He'd spent his life being the storm. He'd never even looked for the light. He thought of the sketchbook, the monster, which she had asked. He finally had the answer. He had become the monster. And now he was this. Nothing. An empty man in an empty room, haunted by a piece of art he'd once called amateurish. He touched the rough canvas, the paint thick and dry under his fingers. It was the only truth he had left. On that same spring evening, 200 miles away, the Midtown Arts Collective was throwing its grand reopening. It was no longer a hobby or a co-op. It was the city's newest, most vibrant cultural institution, having just secured a massive endowment. The warehouse space was unrecognizable. It was packed not with stiff lawyers in tuxedos, but with artists, musicians, writers, and patrons. The light was bright, the music was loud, and the energy was electric. On a small stage, bathed in a warm spotlight, stood Ilara Vance. She was not the quiet grey accessory Marcus had demanded. She wore a vibrant red dress, her hair was down, and her eyes, those same sharp eyes as her father's, scanned the crowd with a new, unshakable confidence. She was luminous. "Good evening," her voice, once a whisper, rang out, clear and strong. "They say that art is a luxury, that it's a hobby, something messy to do in your spare time." In the back of the room, Julian Croft smiled, standing next to Judge Vance. "I'm here to tell you that art is not a luxury. It is a necessity," Ilara continued. "It is messy. It's supposed to be, because our lives are messy. Our truths are messy. Art is the one thing that doesn't lie. It's the mirror that shows us who we really are. It shows us our shadows, and it shows us our light." The crowd erupted in applause. Ilara locked eyes with her father. He wasn't the iron gavel. He was just Dad. He was beaming a pride so pure and bright it was almost blinding. He raised his glass to her in a simple, profound salute. Later, Julian found her by the Maria Sanchez sculpture. "That was a magnificent speech, Ilara," he said, handing her a glass of champagne. "Thank you for coming, Julian, and thank you for what you did, for the Kensington tenants. It was the only thing to do," he said simply. "You showed me the path. Those photos, they were more powerful than any legal brief I could have written. You gave those people a voice. It was a clear-cut case of character. Theirs and, well, Kensington's." They stood in a comfortable, respectful silence. The noise of the party swirled around them, a happy, vibrant storm. Have you heard from him?" Julian asked, his voice low. Ilara's smile didn't falter, but her eyes held a flicker of ancient history, a wound long since scarred over. "My lawyer finalized the divorce last month," she said, looking at the sculpture, not at him. "He's somewhere, working. I received a single certified check in the mail last week. It was for the painting, the one he always hated. He paid me what he thought it was worth. Far too much." She paused. I hope he finds what he's looking for. I hope he finds a way to live with himself." "And you?" Julian asked. "Have you?" Ilara turned to him, her smile returning genuine and full. She looked around the room at the art that was her soul, at the people she had brought together, at the life she had built. Not a life she had hidden from, but a life she had forged for herself in the full, honest light. "Yes," she said. "I think I finally have." Marcus Thorne locked his small office. The clock on the town hall steeple struck 9. He walked down the creaking wooden stairs, the smell of tomorrow's baking bread from the bakery below filling the air. He stepped onto the quiet, empty street. He caught his reflection in the dark bakery window. He didn't see the shark. He didn't see the rising star. He saw a tired man in a rumpled suit that was slightly too large for him, a man with lines around his eyes that weren't from smiling. He thought of the gala, the alcove, the coffee stain. He had been so wrong, so profoundly, catastrophically wrong. He'd spent his entire life trying to impress people of power, trying to perform character. He realized far too late that he had been living with true power. The quiet power of Ilara's paintbrush, the silent power of her father's integrity. He had mistaken her quietness for weakness and her privacy for simplicity. He understood now. The gala hadn't been his moment to shine. It had been his trial. He was the one on the stand. And in the dark, curtained alcove, when he thought no one important was watching, he had given his own testimony. He had shown the world exactly who he was. Ilara and her father hadn't even been the jury. They were just the witnesses to his own self-inflicted verdict. He turned from his reflection, the monster from the sketch his only companion, and walked alone into the quiet, swallowing darkness. The story of Marcus Thorne is a brutal reminder that character isn't something you perform for a powerful audience. It's what you are when you think no one is looking. He had the world at his fingertips, but he forgot that true power isn't about how many people you can control, but how many you treat with respect, especially those you think are beneath you. He didn't just lose his wife and his job. He lost his own soul because he was blinded by ambition. What did you think of Marcus's downfall? Was it justice, or was it just a terrible miscalculation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, and you want more gripping tales of drama, consequence, and poetic justice, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a good story, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss a single update. Thanks for listening.